Hey, welcome to the Rain and Morale podcast. So do you ever feel like screaming out in the office, on Zoom or outside the school gates, for the love of God, come on, really? Then if this is you and you're looking for an honest, fun and frank podcast on life and business, then sit back and listen to me, Rain and Morale. I'll be bringing great people on the show to talk, share and debate their life experiences and business challenges, keeping the show unpolished, but in a fun and unique British style, with sarcasm, tenacity, and maybe a few swear words or tears. This podcast keeps it real, honest, raw, and removes the bullshit in the only way I know how, through authenticity and getting shit done. Think of it less like the Housewives of New York or Towie with the lipo and drama, and more like the house lives of the real world. I hope you'll take something away to be better informed, laugh, smile, or maybe even finally getting the confidence to shout, come on really. So enjoy. Welcome to the Rain and Morale podcast. How are you?
I'm fine, thanks, Rona. Thank you for having me.
Oh, you're very welcome. So for the listeners, I'm delighted to introduce Paul Hinks, who is currently based in New York. And Paul and I first met through a mutual networking group, and we've had a few interesting conversations, and there's a really lively chat that we're both involved in. But I'm really pleased to have Paul here today because very recently Paul wrote a critical article actually about the West's green energy policies and how they themselves might be keeping Africa poor. And we're going to come on to talk about that in a moment. But as a brief introduction to Paul, he is the founder and chairman and chief executive of Symbion, and a US power investor that you develop finance, infrastructure, construction, operational, all of those things around electrical power infrastructure in the developing world. You've also got a new venture which is called MyHydro. You're also the chairman on Invest Africa, and I know that you are hugely respected in the energy space as one of the largest US investors, and you've been used by the government. You've worked in the UK, the US, Middle East, Africa, and all over. So welcome, Paul, and thank you for coming on the show.
No, thanks for having me. You didn't mention lovely places like Iraq and Afghanistan that we worked.
Exactly. It's probably, well, if I'd have given actually everybody your true bio, I think we would have spent an awful long time on that. So no, it's brilliant to have you here. And having someone that's worked in the energy space for so many decades. I don't want to make you sound older than you are, but you've been doing this for a few decades. And with this whole focus now and change and shift on ESG, green energy transition, you really are best placed to kind of look at it from both sides. So I guess if we dive in, what made you write the article in the first instance about the obsession of the West and some of the rules that we're putting into place? What triggered you to write it?
Well, somebody actually a public relations company knew my views about this and asked me if I would write a piece for the Boston Herald explaining what those views are all about. So that's how it came about.
Okay, brilliant. And so for anyone who's doesn't understand kind of this space, obviously it's often seen that the West has essentially been allowed to develop, and we've had infrastructure, and that's actually happened through the industrialization and fossil fuels. And then we've got the global South, be it all of Sub-Saharan Africa, a major part in that, who essentially haven't been able to develop at the same pace. So when we talk about this green transition, and you've got countries like the UK, Europe, America, who won't invest or are stopping fossil fuel or potentially, and we'll talk about this, natural gas contracts in these regions. What's your view on how that's really impacting the locals?
Okay, maybe we can start with a few fundamentals, because I think that informs where these views, and these views are not just mine. I think that they're pretty common if you go around the African continent and you talk to people in Africa. I'm really echoing, but I've been saying it for a long time. You know, the thing is, I mean, you can't really compare the likes of Europe, the United States, Canada, even some parts of Asia, and these days Latin America, because the available access to electricity in Africa is so much worse than it is anywhere else. So if you go around the world, I mean, you can get on the internet, you can get access to electricity statistics, and you can see that you know, even Latin America and Asia these days, the statistics are 90% connectivity up to 100%. Obviously here we get 100%. In Europe, UK, you get 100%. So, you know, then you go to Africa and you start going around the different countries in Africa and you see figures like 20%, 30%. You know, a good figure in Africa would be like 60, 70% is really doing well. And then you have to consider that those statistics are weighted in favor of the urban areas. So the statistics might be 30% in a big city, but you go to the rural areas, it's like 2%, 3%, 5%. Right? So connectivity, and you know, we all know that statistic of there's, well, I think it's 1.3 million people in Africa, and half of them haven't got electricity. Well, it's true, and that has been a fundamental stumbling block on the development of those countries in Africa. There are many reasons why Africa is, in a lot of countries, not everywhere, but a lot of countries, is underdeveloped. But electricity access is a huge contributor to that lack of development.
Yeah.
So you have this urban versus rural electrification problem. Now, you also have another fundamental, and this has been the case for as long as I can remember, and that's going back a while away. A lot of the countries in Africa, and I really, when I talk about that, now it's happening in South Africa, but before that, you know, I was talking sort of north of the Limpopo and in the rest of Africa, Sub-Saharan Africa. They haven't had enough capacity in each country to serve the electricity demand that's created by the customers. Okay, so you hear stories of, you know, a lot of discussions for decades about interconnections, which is great in theory because you can trade them power from one country to the next. But if both of them don't have enough power for themselves, how do you export power from one to the other? And that's been another stumbling block, lack of available capacity. But to a fashion, what's happened is Africa has developed in the early stages, I would say from the 60s, you know, after independence or whatever, they focused heavily on hydro, large hydropower, big dams, the sort of Karibas and the Teras in Tanzania and Akasombo, and you know, all these large dams. Well, we know what's happened there is we now have a situation whereby the inflows to those dams is compromised, either by lack of precipitation, rainfall, or, I hate to say it, guys, but sometimes mismanagement of the dam's resources, where they let out more water than they have coming in. So they don't manage it until it becomes a crisis, like they have in Zambia and Zimbabwe, or have had until recently in Zambia and Zimbabwe, and then they address it. So you have this capacity problem. Hydro has been one solution. in places where there's natural gas, some projects such as Tanzania, Ghana, they've managed to develop natural gas resources, and they use natural gas to produce electricity. Mostly it's been offshore, and they have undersea pipes, and then they produce this this power. So you have that. Then what else do they have? You go all over Africa and you see heavy fuel oil, and you see diesel. Okay, and when you start to talk about emissions, that's where you start to get into, you know, difficult situation, given the current requirements for climate change mitigation and reduction of greenhouse gases. So you have this situation where they're operating with hydro, with gas, with heavy fuel oil, with diesel, and nowadays, you know, in the last 15 years or so, we're seeing wind and solar. South Africa has had a big renewables program. It's been very successful. The cost of solar has reduced somewhat dramatically. And so, you know, that's a good story. However, because there's this lack of capacity in each of these countries, and even today, it's still like that. Some are coming on much faster than others, but the lack of capacity is what causes the load shedding and that sort of situation. So because of lack of capacity, you now have a situation where they can't satisfy what they call the base load. Okay, right. And base load is the amount of electrical generating capacity you need in order to deliver power to the customers who are connected, without load shedding anybody. Right?
So sorry to dive in there, just but for anyone who doesn't understand load shedding, and the only reason why I do is because I'm involved, you know, with a few companies in Africa. So you would think South Africa, biggest, you know, country, wealthiest in Africa, blah blah blah, but actually what's happening is we've got between 4-8 hours a day where there is zero electricity because they can't supply. Is that right?
I spoke to one of our guys yesterday, and they'd had 11 hours off in a part of Cape Town, or so, you know, a certain area.
Right.
Whether that was the whole of Cape, I don't know. It could have been just her area. But anyway, the fundamental issue here is that you have to have enough power to supply those consumers who are connected, whether they're residential consumers, they're commercial consumers like stores, shops, banks, whatever, or they're industrial like factories, whatever. You have to have enough of that.
Yeah.
And without that, you can't introduce things which are intermittent, like wind and solar, because obviously solar only works, well, in Africa most of the time up to 5:30, 6 p.m. at night, and you have to switch it off. Right? Wind blows in and out. It doesn't always. I was recently, well, actually 2 years ago, I was in Seychelles, and they're very proud of. They have, I think it's 6 wind turbines near the port that was supplied to them by, I believe, Abu Dhabi. I promise you, most of the times we drove past it, the blades were not turning. Now, whether that was, but I was told it was because of lack of wind. And so if you have those situations where the sun isn't shining, or it's a bad day for irradiation, or you have wind that has stopped blowing, any sailor will tell you, anybody who sails like I used to will tell you that you know, what happens when the wind stops blowing? You're sitting on your boat, not going anywhere. It's the same.
Yeah.
It's the same with wind turbines. So those things, they come on and off. So if you haven't got enough base load and you lose either of those solar or winds,
Yeah.
you're stuck because you have nothing else to come in to take over. Now, where it gets, I think, a little bit confusing is a lot of people think that, okay, these days with electric cars and batteries and lithium ion and what they call flow batteries, with all these new gadgets coming in, new things, and they are relatively new. With all these things coming in, everybody thinks, oh, it's simple. You just you put your solar charges your battery, and then you run your battery at night. Well, you know, you first have to differentiate between what is on-grid electricity and what is off-grid electricity.
Mm-hmm.
Now, if you have a solar array, let's say it produces 100 megawatts, okay, you can deliver that or whatever megawatts output it will deliver, and they often don't deliver the amount that you've sort of installed, because you have efficiencies during the day with the sunlight.
Yeah.
So you have this solar on grid, and it's fine. If you lose it, then something else takes over. And so if you've got a coal-fired power plant, or you've got gas, or you've got whatever, at night you run that, and your grid is satisfied by that. So you can run perhaps lower cost, or lowish cost electricity from solar during the day. But then when you go off grid, okay,
Yes.
you're not connected to anything else. So if you lose if you have solar, and even if you have a battery, and if that goes off, let's say the battery runs out, there is nothing. There's nothing to supply it. So whilst it's all that is good stuff, it's renewable, it ticks all the boxes. When it comes to the Africa context, where there is an absolute huge problem of capacity and base load, and lack of transmission, because you know these off-grid locations. I'll give you an example where one of the places we're working at the moment, we're we're investing in building some hydro plants around a off-grid city called Mbuji-Mayi. It's called Mbuji-Mayi in the Democratic Republic of Congo. Now, you know, when I say to people we're going to connect off-grid, the sort of vision is of a few village houses, you know, rudimentary sort of buildings, and that's it. Mbuji-Mayi is off-grid, essentially, and it is I think Wikipedia says it's 3.7 million people. So that probably means it's 4+ or something, right?
Yeah, yeah.
That is a lot of people and a big city. And we're going to be one of the first people there's a tiny little bit of power, 4 megawatts, I think, in one area. But we're going to be one of the first companies putting power into Mbuji-Mayi. There are others doing it too, but it doesn't have anything, right? So now we go back to, so that's because there's no transmission. They haven't got a centralized generation which transmits electricity all over the continent, all over the country, whatever. So now let's go back to base load and intermittence. They call these intermittents VREs, variable renewable energy. Now, you look at various countries in Africa, their base load We'll look at South Africa, for example. The base load in South Africa comes from quite a bit of coal, quite a lot of coal-fired power stations, which is very cheap. And it comes from nuclear. There are some thermal plants such as HFO and diesel. And yeah, they've got renewables. They've got the wind and the solar. But again, that's intermittent. It's not saving South Africa from load shedding, particularly, when it's nighttime and the solar isn't producing. So to be frank, load is obviously a lot less at night, so it's less of a challenge. But okay, so now you have these different types of base load. Where I think there's a problem, well, I know there's a problem. In all of those countries that, Sub-Saharan Africa, most of them, they have coal. It's in the ground.
Yeah.
Right? They, some of them have gas. It's in the ground or under the sea. Okay, now, if we take the narrative that comes out of the West, it is, we should, and don't get me wrong, I absolutely agree with this policy in the developing world, whatever. My comments are specific to Africa, right?
Okay, yeah, okay.
So the narrative that comes out is that we should stop using, or Africa should stop using fossil fuels. Okay.
Yeah.
Now, when it comes to gas, nobody's saying definitely no, right?
Mm-hmm.
However, if you go to any bank today, any lender, they are going to prefer renewables. Okay.
Yes.
So companies like us, which are investing in this stuff, what are we doing? We're going to do renewables because we know we can get money for that. But we can't get money easily for gas. Forget it if you're going to try and do a coal-fired power plant. Right?
Yeah.
And yet the resource is buried in the ground. There are coal mines all over. So that's where I think that there is a problem. If you look at the United States or China or UK or most of the industrialized European countries, they are chucking out greenhouse gases on a scale that's unimaginable. It's huge, right? So my question is, if a country in Africa, let's just take any country, isolated country in Africa, has a natural resource which is in the ground, coal, for example, or gas, and in some cases oil. In Uganda they have oil, and they're going to produce power with heavy fuel oil. Now, why make it difficult for them to develop that when it's a natural resource? They want to use what they have. They don't want to import, and they don't want to be stuck with risky renewables that do not satisfy their baseload and come in and out. They're intermittent. Does that make sense?
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I've got, I guess, a ton of questions kind of going around in my mind on this one. And so very much, obviously, I'm kind of more of the knowledge and education from a West point of view about going green and the implications of using fossil fuels on pollution, and even natural gas, which is 50% better in terms of CO2, but pumps out way more methane. And so it's kind of, for me, where I want to kind of chat to you as well is about Africa has a right, as does the global south, to develop. And so for me, it's very much they should have an entitlement to, a fair income, education, healthcare, strong agricultural background, technology that isn't held by a license of somebody, in the West. What do you say then to those that sort of say, well, like Kenya, for example, if we let them build with wind and solar, I think, and actually because actually the only thing really stopping it is the power of storage and infrastructure. There are those that say we can do that even if we had a ton of solar in the Sahara Desert, that then the infrastructure, so that we make sure they're not reliant on Russian natural gas or what the top countries are, Russia, Iran, Qatar, so for me, it's like, take our mistakes, you guys need and should develop, but don't develop the way we developed, because then, do you see what I'm saying? Like,
yeah, so I have a very simplistic view about this is, we, the West, are the people that have messed up the atmosphere, the ionosphere. Yeah. It's our emissions which have caused the problem. I am not saying go and turn Africa into the same situation we have here in the United States, or whatever. I'm not saying go and do that. I'm saying all it takes in these countries is one decent sized power plant. In a lot of these countries, 1, 2 coal fire or gas fire power plants, and their problems are over. Then they'll have a base load, right? Now, there are some countries very lucky, such as Kenya, okay? Kenya, and again, it's another country we're investing in. They have geothermal, okay? And geothermal is where you drill holes into the fault lines of in a volcanic area. And in the Great Rift Valley, there's a lot of steam under the ground. And Kenya has, over the last couple of decades, has developed to become one of the leading countries in the world in geothermal. Yeah. Geothermal is base load. It operates 24 hours, 7 days a week. So with geothermal and hydro, which they also have, they have the potential to become 100% renewable with base load. They also have wind and they have solar, of course. Now that all works, but they're still today, as things stand today, they're still running a lot of very expensive heavy fuel oil plants, because the fuel that goes into those is enormously expensive. It's not just about emissions. It's, you think about it, that's all imported. Fuel imports. One of the biggest, the most corrupt things that happens in many countries, not just Africa, is linked to the supply of fuel, imported fuels. Because you think how much huge contracts are let with that. So sometimes those fuel prices are even inflated more than they should be. It's a complicated scenario, but you see, what I'm saying is it shouldn't be a big problem for African countries to have a limited number of fossil fuel power plants. And obviously, if there's gas there, you prefer gas to coal and things. But why do we want to lecture Africa and tell them that they shouldn't be using these natural resources that they have in their ground, on the banks? I mean, the biggest problem is the banks won't put up any money for it, or they make it difficult. So they can't get projects developed. So that's my whole point, is that our policies of sorting out the mess we have created, right? Yeah. And when you apply them to Africa, essentially it's just not fair, because you have the major, let's not call it disaster, but major area of need, where there's a shortage of generation capacity, which is what I was talking about at the outset. And they have the stuff in the ground that they need in order to solve the problem. But now what we're telling them, is no, you can't. It's you should be looking at doing renewables only. And it just doesn't work in all the countries in Africa. So for me, we, again, being very simplistic about it, the West, should be looking in the mirror and solving the West's, because, I don't know how many power plants there are in the United States or Britain or I mean, we've all driven up the highways and the motorways and seen big chemical industrial plants and things. There's the problem. Not one power plant in Malawi or in Senegal or somewhere like that. So it's, and South Africa. I mean, look, South Africa's had a lot of problems. There's a lot of problems. But the principle of having some large coal-fired power plants and nuclear, I agree with 100%. Now, do I agree that we should be building new coal-fired power plants in the United States? No, I don't agree with that. It's specific to the Africa thing. And so what I've noticed in the last couple of years has come out of the COPs is, they now call it the just transition. And I'm not quite sure what that's supposed to mean, the just transition.
Feels like wrong English, doesn't it? The just transition.
I mean, is it like justice? I mean, is it transition, but be fair to people? I don't really quite know what it means. But if that's what it means, as it applies to Africa, I think we have to be fair to the continent, and we have to allow the development to take place, and we shouldn't be telling people in Africa, and the banks should be supporting. They should be saying, yes, we will finance a coal-fired power plant, but maybe there's restrictions. Maybe you could say, well, we're only going to allow so much, so that the carbon footprint that's being emitted is only this much. I was going to ask
you that, because we talk about, do we go down the route of fossil fuels and natural gas to allow at least a base load across, again, I'm being simplistic, but across each country, but that is limited to a time frame or a period of greenhouse gas emissions. Until then, we grow the infrastructure, the cost of wind, solar, because obviously with geothermal and hydro as well, we've got those challenges as well, haven't we, about what happens upstream and downstream from where we put hydro plants in. How long can geothermal last? It's still that extraction, essentially, of nature. And also, how do we, Paul, ensure that what Africa can extract, because let's be honest, everything we need for an electrical future is pretty much sat in the ground in Africa. How do we ensure a just transition that is fair to locals, that is owned by locals, by local kind of businesses? And that you talked a little bit about corruption, and I get a bit angry about that when people say that about Africa, because it's no bloody different to here in England. It's just polished in a different way. It happens all day, every day, and we're not stupid. So
I was talking to sorry for interrupting. I was talking to somebody, and an investor, last week, in actual fact. I was at a big conference in LA, and this investor asked me about Africa, and he said to me, but we don't want to go there, it's sort of difficult and lots of challenges, risks, and it's corruption. So I asked him to tell me, which countries have you invested in the last sort of 20 years? The first one he quotes to me is Russia. There's no corruption in Russia. I mean, Jesus, So, yeah, those things are a challenge. And I was talking specifically related to the fuel supplies. But let me tell you something else about hydro. What's happening here at the moment, and I think in Europe too. There's a big movement now against dams, big dams, and they are actually now breaking dams down and destroying.
Seeing this,
you have. I watched a video recently at a conference where there's a tribe, an American, I think it's American Indian tribe, and their whole life has been changed because they lived off the river and they're fishing, and their whole life's changed because a big dam was built, and it ruins the whole way of life. So the lobby that exists now for these type of dams, and there's a lot of small dams as well in the US, in rivers, where fish need to go upstream to spawn,
and they can't,
and they can't do it. And it's fascinating. I've learned about what's going on, in some of these things here recently. It's quite interesting. So what's happening here is that they're switching to what they call run of river, where you have a small turbine, and instead of having one big one, you have many little ones. That's something we're doing with MyHydro, as you mentioned earlier. So we now have lots of little ones, and that's brilliant for Africa because you can pick a river and you can put a number of turbines along that river. You don't dam it, you don't displace anybody, you don't ruin the ecology, and it's very environmentally friendly. So there's a move towards that. And the other problem has been that big dams, the amount of water that's being collected in the catchment may have changed over the last 20 years, 30 years from what it was when they projected for the construction of these things. So there's a lot of changes going on generally, but my article and my beliefs are that it's sort of, come on guys, cut Africa a bit of slack, and the activists who come out screaming about fossil fuels, it isn't going to be the end of the world for there to be a few power plants. Now, again, I'm also not saying go and destroy beautiful forests and equatorial forests in Africa, with drilling for oil and this and that and the other. I'm not talking about that. I'm talking specifically about electricity production and baseload power, and having some sort of a measured plan so that these countries can get cheap electricity. I mean, even in the UK, yes, they've been shutting coal-fired power plants down, but even the UK, there's one of the cheapest sources of power used to be coal.
Of course.
I used to work for the UK Electricity Authority, which was called in those days, before it was privatized, it was called the Central Electricity Generating Board.
Right.
And CGB did all the generation and the transmission above 132 kilowatts. So 275, 400, and later on higher up. And it was a well-run utility, and it had a lot of coal. Drax, I can't remember how many megawatt Drax was in Leeds, in Yorkshire. These were huge power plants. And then there's another type of thing that people are talking a lot about at the moment, which is pump storage. And from
Did
storage,
you say pump storage?
pump storage. And
Right.
when I was training in the late 70s, now I'm giving my age away. But when I was training in the late 70s, I spent a little bit of time, studying a power plant that was built in North Wales called Dinowic. And
Right.
they basically took a mountain that had a lake on top of the mountain, which fills up with water. Inside the mountain, they built tunnels. The water would come down, go through the turbines, through a turbine floor, go out the other side, and then collect in a reservoir at the bottom of the mountain. And then at night, they would use pumps. They would pump the water back up. They basically use the turbine as pumps, pump the water back up to the top. So overnight, the water's all going back up, and then during the day, it's coming down. And there was a tariff which was different between the day and the night. So it worked. That's another thing that's just come on. But I think the point I'm trying to make is that a lot of this stuff, I mean, solar and wind is new, but a lot of this stuff like pump storage, it goes back to the 70s in the UK and in America and places. So there are a lot of good proven solutions in the renewable space. But I just think it's wrong to restrict Africa from
some of its natural
being able to develop its power capacity using its own natural resources. And I'm pretty sure if you went to any African energy minister, he would say, I agree.
Well, of course, no, absolutely, and it's easy, I suppose in a lot of ways, I would be classed as an activist, someone who's really passionate about this movement, but equally through the work that I do with, Education Africa, I'm really aware of. Even before, I've had some amazing offers to help the children with technology and all of this, and I've gone, well, it'd be great, but they can't charge the iPads, and even if they could, the data is really expensive, so it just you can't apply. They need a base level of education, health, energy, all of these things before we can even start to shoot for the stars. So I guess it's that challenge, that mix between, if we had that wand, how many coal plants or natural gas should we allow across the continent to get to that base rate? But then instead of setting them off on using those things for, say, chemical fertilizers, actually what we invest in is the infrastructure for natural fertilizers so that they don't ruin the waterways. And like you say with hydro, if I cut if I block an artery in my heart, I know damn well what's going to happen. So this, like you say, it's dialing up those proven technologies. It's speaking to those indigenous community people. There's swathes of communities displaced in China where we've got these huge hydros. So it's great to hear that you're looking at those things and seeing how we can innovate.
We're actually, our company, Symbion Power and MyHydro, all we're doing these days is renewables. So on the one hand, I'm saying that this is the case, but the reason that I'm not building a gas-fired power plant anymore, we've owned gas-fired power plants, plenty of them, but the reason we're not doing it is why? Because it's such an uphill battle to get them financed. It's so much easier. There's so much money available in the world today, both equity and debt, that will support renewable energy, and it's the way to go for sure. But Africa seems to be sort of, decades behind, and it needs, I guess that's why they call it transition, but it needs support for these things. Now, I don't think for a minute that anything I say or anybody else says is going to get the lenders to start supporting coal-fired power plants. That ain't going to happen. We all know that, right? So whilst I've talked about the realities of it all, but I think natural gas and natural gas networks can be an important role, play an important role. But it's sad when you have a landlocked country, for example, that doesn't have natural gas, and it has a big coal resource. And so, there's a lot of issues. I mean, you go to Nigeria. Nigeria's got tons of gas. It just hasn't got tons of gas in the right places. It's flaring gas,
Right.
but it doesn't necessarily have the pipelines everywhere. It is, the transmission system in Nigeria is abysmal. They've got some good power plants there. We used to be a part owner of one of them, and that was a natural gas plant. So they had a program. I can remember 10 years ago, there was a big program in Nigeria to, I had a list of transmission lines that were going to be financed by this one and that one and the other one. But how much of it's been done? This much. It's not really happening as it should. And then what you see in Nigeria, and you see in the Congo, you see in all these places, is diesel generators chugging away in somebody's backyard with black smoke coming out. I mean, what's more
polluting?
More polluting, worse for the environment than that. And that's my problem with it all is, why not? Okay, and actually, when you come to coal, you can get what they call clean coal now. It's a lot.
Really? Come on.
I know it doesn't sound.
You can't put clean or green in front of it. How does that even work?
No, that's what they call it. It's to do with the technology that's takes care of the emissions. I mean, there are ways of taking care. I remember I once worked on in the UK near Chester. There was a power plant we were operating on, and this is again late 70s, and I was a trainee, but it was oil-fired power plant, and big one, 1,000 megawatts or more, and we used to take our cars to work and park them in the big car park there, and all of our cars had burn marks on the paint because of the emissions coming out of the stack, the chimney, and then sort of well, I guess it was acid rain coming down and ruining our paintwork on our cars.
Imagine if you're a kid or you're a family, right next to something like that. I mean, that's horrific.
And they're there. The place was next to lots of estates and things in that area.
Yeah, so, I think, but in the same breath, we're still here today extracting from Africa to enable this green transition. But sadly, the benefits of that commercially and financially aren't being fed back into those countries. Yeah, so in one way, we're saying you can't build, but in the next breath, we're also saying, but we'll take all your rare minerals and precious metals and all this. But even that's still not allowing them. We're going through like this industrialization process, a green one, but it's still not benefiting them. So at what point, where is it in the system that we go, well, this isn't working because it's still not benefiting them?
Yeah, no, I mean, I've worked in many countries in Africa, and we're investing in some countries at the moment. They're frankly quite challenging. I mean, we're in the Eastern Congo,
right.
Developing projects there. We're going to develop a project similar to one we developed in Rwanda on Lake Kivu. Lake Kivu produces gas, methane gas, and CO2. That terrible word, which goes into the to the depths of the lake. It's not gas that you drill for. It sort of leaks into the water, and it's quite a deep lake. I mean, it's up to, I think, close to 500 meters deep.
Right.
In certain cases, and it's sort of got a rolling bottom bed. But this it's biogas. It goes into the water, saturates the water, and there's a way of, you put barges on the surface, pipes down, and you suck the water from the bottom up, just like you do auto siphoning. So it's the same. It's the same as when you run out of fuel gas with your car, and you take a jerry can and you do that, and it goes. Or your aquarium, right? When you aquarium. So it's obviously it's much bigger, and you suck this water up, and as it comes up and the pressure changes, the gas separates from the water. So although it's we end up with a mixture of methane and carbon dioxide, and some smaller gases like sulfur and things like that. And that goes up onto the barge through a tank. The water that's been separated goes back into the lake. We then pump that. We compress it, dry it, compress it, and pump it to the land. We then, through a scrubbing process in what they call a wash water tower, we separate the carbon dioxide from the methane and the other nasty gases, and then we take them back into the water, take them down about 80 meters, and we let them go back into the water. So the CO2 is taken out. Then the methane gas goes into a generator plant, generator plant. We produce electricity. So that's a form of using a natural resource to develop an electricity system and produce electricity using that lake. So that's the only lake in the world that produces methane like that. There's some in Cameroon that produce CO2 only. But there's a lot of what's the saying, old wives' tales about it, that people call them exploding lakes. But the reality is, to try and get that gas out is difficult enough, even when you're trying. It's very unlikely in Lake Kivu that gas will escape unassisted, let's put it like that. It would have to be something related to the extraction process. So if you do it safely. And there are now 3 plants on Lake Kivu on the Rwanda side that do that, and we're doing the first one on the Eastern Congo side of the lake to supply the Eastern Congo and Goma and that area.
Amazing.
That's an example of something that it's a biogas. It's not regular natural gas. So,
no, but we're doing things like that in the UK, where we're collecting from cows, and the farmers have got the tanks and they siphon off the top, and then they use that for the energy. Exactly. So it's that kind of, if you're going to create it, reuse it, and then just keep that circle going, rather than this extraction model.
Yeah. So, but having said that, right soon we'll be into getting this thing financed.
Yeah.
Lenders. I'm sure the conversation we're going to be having for the DRC for this project is going to be more challenging, not just because of the fact that it's the DRC, Eastern Congo, but it's going to be more challenging than it was when we were looking for investors and lenders for the project in Rwanda, which was the same technology, same thing. But it's a few years ago, and now the emphasis on climate change has increased and whatever. I mean, I think we can do it. We will do it. But it's not like, people are lining up ready to finance a project like that on Lake Kivu. Having said that, the town of Goma, I'm not quite sure exactly how many people are, because you can read stuff on the internet and it says maybe 1 million people. Then you talk to people out there and they say, no, it's 2 million people. Well, whatever it is, it's big, and everybody's using diesel generators. I mean, they're everywhere. It's got there's diesel generators, and then there's good company. Was a couple of good companies who are operating there. One called Virunga, which I think is from the UK. They've built a hydro plant. They're going to build a couple of hydro plants in very challenging area of the eastern DRC, not far from where the gorillas are.
Right.
And the other type of gorillas, the
yeah,
rebels,
yeah, there's two. Yeah,
the rebels. And you know, so that's a good thing. And then there's another company that that's done a solar installation with using a Tesla battery as its backup. And
I've seen these new ones. I've seen a few people even in the UK installing these new Tesla batteries, and they're now like, I guess the challenge here is that like even if you want to do that, you can't get off grid because we are locked into a grid, and obviously that comes down to control and, you know, the money going in. So I think I do wonder deeper if a lot of this is about money, about investment, about how much the returns are, versus actually just doing the right thing for a continent that deserves.
It's all about that. I mean, let's be honest.
So much better. Well,
it's all about
trying to be
that.
polite. Yeah. if I said to you though tomorrow, Paul, do you know what? I'm going to fund your projects. I'm going to fund all the solar projects in Africa. I'm going to do this, this, and this. And actually, I don't want any return. I you know, literally, I'm not going to charge you any interest. I don't want any return. Can you imagine?
Yeah, I mean, there are organizations, there are some great foundations that their return is, you know, a different type of return than just money. And there's some good funds here that I would say are real, true development funds, not just here, but around the world. But are really great development funds. But for me and our company, I can't do anything that doesn't give a decent double-digit IRR. You know, if we can't tell our investors that we're getting that, they don't want you to do it. You know, and no. I don't want to do it either. So the thing is that you have to find something that allows you to get a reasonable return, fair. You know, not 43% like I believe the UK utilities are making.
Don't talk to me about UK utilities right now. Oh.
Yeah, they're making a fortune, but we need to get a decent return to make everybody happy. But at the same time, we have to do what we're doing without punishing the end user on the price that they pay for electricity. And I can tell you something about that, you know, when you are off grid and you have solar and you have a battery, and sometimes in addition to that, they will have a diesel generator, or they have solar panels and a diesel generator only. So the generator runs at night and the solar panels during the day. When you add the CapEx, the capital expenditure of those different systems, the solar panels, the battery, which batteries are very expensive still today. Yes. These lithium-ion batteries and things, they really cost a lot of money. And the size of them to go utility scale means that you spend a lot of money on it. And then if you have generators where you have to buy the generator and then you have to put in fuel, the electricity tariff goes right up. So you see great stories about mini grids, for example. But what's been happening is, and this is the challenge that the mini grid companies have, is the cost of their electricity in cents per kilowatt hour. I mean, I think the lowest one we've seen so far, in our experience, there might be lower, is 35 cents. But more often than not, it's 40 cents, 45 cents and more. And I've seen situations like companies charging that. Now, if you think that in a city in Africa, which is on the grid, supplied by the government utility, the price is probably going to be more like 15 cents to 15 to 18 cents. You have a situation whereby the disposable income in the city is obviously much greater than it is in the rural areas.
Of course.
But they're paying 2 and 3 times more for their electricity through off-grid solar, which they don't understand because it's the sun. So everybody says, well, how is it that the sun is free and yet we're paying double to 3 times what they're paying in the city? It doesn't make sense. And I think that that's a big challenge that the people who are doing the mini grids have to face. I went to a conference recently in Nairobi, and one of the themes of the conference was about, well, how can we get the price down to 25 cents? Well, 25 cents
even then
is still expensive. These are in these rural areas. People are living off subsistence. I've been. You go to the village, and you ask the guy, how much do you earn every month, and how do you earn it? And he said, well, I grow potatoes, I grow things, and I take them to the market, and it gives me the equivalent of about $30-40 a month or something like that. Well, you can't spend all that on electricity. Do you see what I mean?
No, and that's if he's got strong soil and there's been precipitation and rain that he's been able to get his produce to even grow in the first place, and then even get it to market. So I think I get exactly what you're saying about the kind of the sentiment around what's double standard from where we sit in this very privileged position, to how and when and why Africa should develop. So
that goes back to the whole thing about off-grid and on-grid. If you have solar, and this is again where some people who are not in the industry get a little bit confused, because if you have on-grid solar, today it's very cheap because all you have is the solar panels, right? And South Africa's brought the prices down. Senegal, Zambia, they've got good prices. 3 US, 4 US cents, 5 US cents, whatever. That's all fine, except of course that it only works for half of the 24 hours, and it's not even that efficient for most of that time as well. But you have solar on grid, fine, but then you go solar off grid. Now, to me, if we're going to have development, you've got to give those people cheap power, right? They have to have low cost power. So if you're not doing that, we ain't going to get the development, because they're going to be difficult for people to afford. And so the principles are all fine. People think, well, if mobile phones can do what they did, and Africa is carpeted now with everybody has 1 or 2 phones, and somehow they manage to pay their bills, and and they would have kerosene. The usual thing in a village is you have kerosene lights and the like, and you shift that to electricity, the money will be available to pay. But it's not going to be so easy if you're charging people 40 cents per kilowatt hour or 35 cents per kilowatt hour. It's got to be brought down somehow. And the way of bringing electricity costs down is to use the cheapest sources of power, right? So, those natural resources are there. That's why they're cheap.
Yeah, and I guess that's always going to be the tussle between, all that opportunity around the amount of wealth there is in the world. Is it then subsidized so that the end user pays their 15 cents or 20 cents, 15 cents, and then the rest is subsidized?
Let me mention one thing.
Yeah, please.
Because it's coming up more and more and more in the conversation, and it's something that as soon as you mention it, everybody runs a mile. But nuclear, right?
Yeah.
Right now, the world is, there are in different companies in different UK, Rolls-Royce here, there's a company in the US doing it, are making these things called SMRs, small modular reactors. They're not big, great, big, huge nuclear power plants. They're little ones. And
Yeah.
in fact, South Africa, I can remember in the 90s, was developing its own small modular reactor, which was called the pebble bed. It was a system using pebbles.
Right.
And I don't know a lot about it, but that technology is good technology. I think there are countries in Africa today which, you know, could be, let's say, trusted to have nuclear technology. And I don't know why that should be looked at more seriously in the next 10 years.
Yeah.
I think if anything, you'll see people like South Africa and Egypt, and those people will be doing it. But there are other countries in Africa where they can have this small reactors, and no one's going to make a bomb from it.
No.
But I know, like, Uganda has its own nuclear research sort of body now for this.
Right.
Rwanda has one. I'm sure there's others, but that could be
a solution.
That could be a good source of power.
Well, listen, I'm sure, Paul, we could talk for a very long time on this, and I best of luck with Symbion and hydropower, and it's great that you're looking at those different ways and kind of challenging. But yeah, I fully support you in terms of that, the need for Africa to develop, what the right path out of that is, and whether they shouldn't use their natural resources. I think for a period of time with maybe some conditions, whilst everything else is focused, I think is a sensible option. So yeah, listen, Paul, thank you so much for coming on and talking about the article you wrote, why you wrote it, and just bringing some realism to what's going on in the continent.
Yeah, I mean, let me just underscore again, I am not against renewables. I don't want I believe in climate change. I do not want to mess up the world, and I fully support all the initiatives. I'm talking about a specific situation in a bunch of countries which have really fallen behind, and could do a lot more if they were able to develop their own natural resources. Now, finally, there are other reasons. It's not just because banks don't want to lend money for these projects. There are other reasons why there are development challenges, and it hasn't happened as it should. But that's for another conversation.
No, absolutely, Paul. There's no way we could have touched on all of those topics. And often sometimes it's better to keep it more slimline and simplistic with a wider audience listening in as well. And like you say, probably for another time as we delve into that. But honestly, thank you so much for your time. And I'm sure we'll chat again soon. Thank you.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you. Bye, everyone.
So that's it. You've made it. The show's over. Thank you for being with us. I hope you've been able to take something away, maybe solve a problem, or just know you're not alone. Here's hoping it made you smile with a few laughs along the way. Please feel free to find me on all social media channels, and you can subscribe to my YouTube channel. Just search the Road and Morale podcast. Have an awesome day, and see you next time.